Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us for this New York Passive House video lecture series, on an introduction to the Passive House Planning Package in IP units. So before we get into the meat of this video series, I want to take our very first video together here and just take a few minutes and walk through some of the very, very basics of the PHPP. What is the PHPP? How is it structured? How are we going to work with it, etc.? So let's take a few minutes and talk about that before we dive into any of the actual modeling work as part of this course. So first of all, the PHPP, the Passive House Planning Package, is an energy model, and it is an Excel-based energy model, meaning that the PHPP itself is actually just a big Excel file. We call that a workbook in Excel parlance. So the PHPP itself is a large workbook, and within that workbook, there are lots of individual worksheets. And the individual worksheets all correspond to one or another element of the building energy model. Things like climate and R values and surface areas, etc., etc. So a couple things about how the PHPP is put together and the sort of basic usage. So first of all, it's an Excel document. It's a spreadsheet. You can only use it in Excel currently. So don't try and use the PHPP in any other application, whether we're talking about Google Sheets or Apple's Numbers program. As far as I'm aware, the PHPP currently, as of 2021, when I'm recording this, only works in Excel. And you should be using Excel in all, my recommendation would be to use Excel better than 2015. So higher than 2015. It may work in older versions of Excel, but it'll be awfully difficult to use in those versions. So make sure you're running the right version of Excel. Make sure you're opening it correctly. And then inside the PHPP, when we open up the PHPP, and we'll have plenty of time to look at this, inside the PHPP, we're going to have all sorts of different worksheets that are going to ask us to input a host of different bits of information. When we talk about energy modeling, that's fundamentally what we're doing. We're taking a real 3D building, and we're distilling it down, we're abstracting it into a list of values, a list of numbers, which can be input into our energy modeling program, in this case, the PHPP. Now, the PHPP is custom designed for passive house buildings. It's custom made for certified passive house consultants and certified passive house designers for the purpose of evaluating building energy consumption and evaluating certification compliance. So our PHPP allows us to input a host of different bits of information, and then we are able to see the results of the annual energy demand calculations, the peak heating and peak cooling load calculations, and the total primary or source energy demand calculations, along with a host of all sorts of other information. But the main bits that we're going to be looking at throughout this course are going to be those three items on the list there. Now, a couple other things just about the structure of the PHPP itself, in particular the IP version. So first of all, the PHPP worksheet, or excuse me, workbook, the PHPP file, Excel file, is protected by default. What does that mean? Well, if you open up a new PHPP, and we'll do that together in a few minutes, what you'll see is that each of the worksheets has a small lock next to its name. So down in the bottom there, in the bottom ribbon, you can see there's a host of different worksheets: verification, check, climate, R values, areas, etc. And they all have a little lock next to their name. And the lock indicates that the worksheet is protected. And what that means in practice is that you're only allowed to input information in certain areas of the worksheet. In particular, there will be certain cells that are color-coded using a yellow background that indicate that you as a user are supposed to input some information in those cells. Now, this is done merely for your protection, to make sure that you don't accidentally break anything inside the PHPP. However, there's no password or any sort of limit on your ability to unprotect those sheets. So if you want to, at any time, you can simply go into your Excel file, go to the review worksheet or the review toolbar, click on that unprotect sheet button, and that'll get rid of that little lock. There's no password, there's no sort of, there's no other protection there. So if you want to, at any time, you can unlock and unprotect those sheets, and there may be times that we might want to do that. And of course, we'll see plenty of those as we move through this course. So again, there's no password or restriction there. They are merely protected for your convenience to try and make sure that you don't accidentally break anything. And again, we will talk all about that as we move through this course. One other thing, just in terms of the basic structure of the PHPP to understand, is that we in this class are going to be using the IP version of the PHPP, the imperial version, inches and feet, that kind of thing, instead of the SI version, the metric version. The PHPP was originally built in metric, so the original PHPP version is a metric tool. And in order to accommodate IP users, what the developers of the PHPP have done is they have sort of made an IP units overlay. So what they've done inside the PHPP is they've gone in and they've copied every single worksheet, and they've changed all the units. But what they've done is they've preserved the original SI version of the PHPP in the background. And this will become important later on if we want to understand exactly what the PHPP is doing and sort of how it's working in the background. All of the actual calculations in the PHPP are all executed in the SI worksheets. So later on, if we ever want to see how something is calculating, if we want to follow some value as it works its way through the PHPP, we're only going to be able to do that in those SI worksheets. So again, we will come back to this later on and we'll take a look at this, but this is an important thing to understand because otherwise it might be quite confusing when you start looking at some of the formulas and sort of trying to trace how the data is moving through. Just know that there's there's an IP version of the PHPP, which is what you see by default, but in the background, there's a whole set of hidden worksheets which are doing the actual work of all the calculations and evaluations. Okay. So that's just a quick introduction. Let's now shift gears and let's take a look at an actual PHPP file, and let's talk about how we work with those files. So I'm over on my computer desktop now, and for purposes of this course, I'm going to be working on my computer. My computer uses the Mac operating system, but if you're working in Windows, pretty much everything that I'll be showing will be identical. Some of the stuff will just look a little bit different, that's all. So I'm here on my computer's desktop, and I've got my Finder open, my file viewer open here, and I've got it open to the PHPP folder. Now, what is this? Well, when you purchased the PHPP, when you bought the PHPP from whomever you bought the PHPP from, whatever reseller you got the PHPP from, what you got was a set of files that looks just like this. So this is what you get when you purchase the PHPP version 9.7 IP. You get a series of folders, and inside of those folders are a series of files. Now, I happen to have these stored somewhere on my computer. You can have them stored wherever you want on your own system. Put them in your Dropbox or your backup system, or however you want to preserve these files. Put them on a USB drive, a backup drive, however you prefer for your process. In any event, you'll get these files somehow, so you have these files, and these are the original PHPP files that you purchased. Now, what are these, though? Let's take a look at these in a little bit of depth, and one at a time here. So we've got a couple of different folders. We have a folder here called PHPP. We have another folder called PHPP variants. We have something called PHECO, stands for economics. We have a PHPP tools, an ERP folder. This stands for the Energy Retrofit Program. And then we've got some README documents and assorted stuff down at the bottom there. So what is all of this stuff? Well, what this is an original version. If I expand this a little bit, we'll see in here, we have a couple of different files. We have one file called PHPP version 9.7 empty, and then another called example. And if I was to open up the PHPP variants, I see pretty much the same thing, PHPP empty and PHPP example, and so on and so on. And we'll take a look at some of these other folders a little bit later as we get into this course. For now, let's just focus on this very first one, PHPP, 01 PHPP. So I've got this empty and this example file here, and they are just what they sound like. The first one is an empty copy of the PHPP. And the example is a pre-populated, completed PHPP that you can use as reference if you have questions about what types of values get input and how a completed, fully functional PHPP should be working, the types of results you should be seeing. So how then do we work with these files? What do we do with these files if we want to, let's say, start a new PHPP project? Well, because the PHPP is just an Excel document, it's not a piece of software. You don't boot up software and click File New or anything like that. That's not how it works. It's just an Excel document. So the important thing to understand about working with this Excel document is you want to preserve this empty version of your PHPP forever. You never want to make any changes or edits to this original file. When you're ready to start a new PHPP document or a new PHPP project, what you're going to do is you're going to make a copy of this empty file. So you're going to make a copy of this empty file. Here I just made a copy on my desktop, and I'll rename it something. I'll call this Ed's PHPP. And now I can go into this PHPP and I can start to populate it with all the information about my building. I can start to edit it. I can start to do whatever I want with it. But notice I've got it's a copy. So I've still got my original PHPP over here that I purchased from the reseller. I've never touched this one. This one has not changed. This one is just how it is, exactly the day that I bought it. Every time that we start a new project, we make a copy of the PHPP, and then we can open this up and start working in it. So let's do that. If I double click on this, this will boot up. It'll take just a second to load up here. And as soon as that is loaded up, I'll pull that in, and here we are. So this is our new PHPP. Again, I'll be working in the Mac OS for purposes of this video tutorial, but if you're working on Windows, it should look basically identical, and the process will all be the same. You're going to make a copy of that empty PHPP file, and then just merely double-click it to open it up in Microsoft Excel. Now, it may be quite intimidating when we first open up the PHPP, as with any type of new software. When we first open it up, there's all sorts of stuff we've never seen before. There's different colors and warnings and red labels all over the place and errors and all sorts of things that might look quite daunting, but don't worry about it. We are absolutely going to go through every single bit of the PHPP in quite a bit of depth. You're going to feel entirely comfortable with it by the time we're done with this course. It'll be old hat, and it'll be, in fact, quite boring by the time you are done with it. I promise. None of it will be terribly intimidating. It's always the same with new software. I'm the same way. You boot up the software, open it up, get spooked by it, turn it off, and go back to your old software. But again, by the time we're done with this class, you'll be very, very confident and comfortable working in this PHPP document. But before we get into any of the nitty-gritty of all this stuff, all these yellow and green cells and everything else, let's just, again, finish up our first video here by talking a little bit about how the PHPP is structured and sort of how we're going to work with it. So first of all, notice that this is an Excel workbook. And I can do all the normal things that I would do with an Excel workbook. I can save it. I can do save as. I can make copies of it, etc., etc. So as I work in it, as I add information to it, I'll just use the normal Excel tools to do things like save, etc. What else about this that's really important? As I noted down on the bottom, we have a whole series of different worksheets inside of the PHPP. So the different worksheets are how we navigate to different topic areas. So we're going to have whole worksheets dedicated to things like building R values, entering surface areas, entering information about the ground, etc., etc. And notice also that each one of these has that little lock next to it, as I indicated. So what does that little lock mean? Well, let's use the verification worksheet here as an example. Let me zoom in a little bit so that we can kind of see what's happening here. And for instance, notice here that we are asked to, on this worksheet, so I'm on the verification worksheet, and you can navigate to different worksheets by merely clicking on the worksheet down at the bottom. Notice also that there's a whole bunch of worksheets, and so we can use this left and right sort of scrubber bar to move through all the different worksheets. So if you don't see verification worksheet, maybe just scroll all the way to the left using the left click button over here. But if you go to the verification worksheet and notice that we've got a whole bunch of input cells here, and these input cells ask us for things like, the architect. So my architecture company, or maybe we'll say Ed's Architecture Company will be the architect on the project. And notice the PHPP allows us to just input information just as we always would using our keyboard. Just type in whatever information that you want. So that worked just fine. What if, though, I want to add some information? Maybe over here I want to add a little note to myself. So maybe I want to add a note that says, a note about the year of construction. Well, notice what happened here. When I tried to come up to the toolbar and click, or if I tried to enter a double click or enter any information on my keyboard, I get this alert. And the alert says the cell or the chart I'm trying to change is protected. To make a change, unprotect the sheet. So what happened there? Well, by default, the way the PHP is set up is that these yellow cells allow us to input data. So any cell that's yellow allows us to put some data in. But if the cell is not yellow, like this cell over here, it will not allow us to input any information. So that's what it means when we say that the PHPP is locked, when we say that the PHPP is protected. Now, of course, as I said, I can unprotect this at any time. So if I really want to enter some information in this cell, I can always come up to Review. So up here at my top toolbar, I come to the Review panel, and I can click on this Unprotect Sheet button. And if I click the Unprotect Sheet button, now I can come into any cell that I want, and I can type in some information. So I can say note to self, etc. However, what it also means is that at this point, now that the PHP worksheet is unprotected, notice there's no little lock next to it, I can also break things. So for instance, if I was to go to a cell like this one, so notice down here, a number of occupants, look up in the toolbar up here, notice that this cell has a formula in it. It's referring to some other worksheet and some specific cell range on that worksheet. Well, I can, now that I've unprotected the sheet, I can delete it. And I can say equals 2. Well, wait, what did I just do? Well, I kind of just broke the PHPP. Now, it's not unforgivable. We can just go up to edit and say edit, undo. So I can undo and then bring that formula back, right? We can always bring that back. But this is the risk of having an unprotected worksheet, is that you can accidentally, often inadvertently, accidentally, make a change to some cell that has an important function or an important reference or an important formula inside of that cell. So you want to be really careful editing the PHP worksheets after you've unprotected them. So my recommendation, if you want to do something like this, is as soon as you've made the change, come back up here to Formula, to Review, and now click on Protect the Worksheet. And when you protect the worksheet, you want to select lock cells, select unlock cells, and select format cells. Leave the rest unselected. And when it asks you for a password, don't put anything in. Now, if you want to, if you really want to lock down your PHP, if you're worried that your colleagues are going to be secretly going in and messing with your PHP, maybe you put a password on. But if you don't put anything, if you put nothing in for the password and just say OK, notice that we've now protected the worksheet. But at any time, I can come back up here, click Unprotect, and take that protection off again without entering a password. Now, we can add a password if we really want to. I'll re-protect this worksheet again, say OK. But my recommendation is just leave it without a password. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Again, unless you're really worried about security or something and you want to sort of lock that down. So the one last piece here before we break this introductory video is just to talk about these worksheets down at the bottom here. Again, remember the way that this program works, the way that the PHP works is that we have all these inch, pound, or IP, imperial inputs. Notice over here, BTUs per square foot, etc., right? So this is an IP version of the PHP, which allows us to input information in feet and inches, but none of the math, none of the actual execution is done in these inch-pound worksheets. All of the actual math of the PHP model is done in the metric version So remember, the metric version sort of lives in the background. It sort of lives behind this overlay, and we can get access to it by coming down here to the bottom, using the right-click mouse button and going to unhide. So again, how did I do that? I came down to this worksheet this worksheet list on the bottom. I used my right mouse button to click on any of the worksheets, and then if I go to this unhide item, unhide will bring up a little dialog box, and it'll allow us to unhide any of the hidden worksheets. Notice there are quite a few of them. So these worksheets in particular, the ones marked with the SI, these are the actual execution. These are the actual calculation worksheets in the background. So if I was to unhide the verification SI, notice that I've got a worksheet which looks very similar. Notice here's even Ed's Architecture Company, but notice none of the cells here are yellow. And that means this worksheet is not for data input. This is a calculation worksheet. It's harvesting data from our IP overlay, from our IP front end, and it's doing all the math in these SI versions, and then it's going to kick the results back to the back to the IP overlay. And again, this will become relevant later on if we're trying to follow any of the calculations or the formulas inside the PHPP, if we want to actually understand how some of the calculations are being effectuated. So I will re-hide that one. I'll just come down here, right-click on this verification SI worksheet, and say hide, and that will hide it. And now I'm back to my normal PHPP without all those metric worksheets. But remember, those are always working in the background. That's where the actual math is being done. Okay, so let's break this video here. We've already gone on for 20 minutes. We will in the future try and keep these to shorter chunks, but wanted to sort of get through this introduction and give you a little bit of a window into the PHPP. When we come back in the next video, we will turn our attention to the example files, the example project that we're going to model together as we work our way through this course. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll look at the actual project that we're going to model together, and then we'll finally get started actually modeling our first PHPP. So I'll see you back in the next lesson. We'll take our time and walk through that example project.